In the commercial sector, we have a slightly different situation. Privacy there is largely consent-based. So it's not inconsistent with what happens in all of these apps where we say, I agree, I agree. Whenever you want to use a new app, whenever you want to use a new device, you'll pick up the device and you'll be given a bunch of options, all of which will have to do with saying yes. And generally speaking, what you'll be looking at will be something called a privacy statement. But if you read it more carefully, you'll discover that it's really a data harvesting statement. So it's about harvesting your data, your personal information, and about with whom it can be shared. And the practical legal reality is, at least at the moment, that if you hit I agree, you're taken to have agreed to those conditions. The irony and the practical difficulty with that is that if you were to read all of those privacy statements, you'd be into a few hundred days per year. And the amount, there has been work done on this. I know that back in 2012 there was a piece of work that said that it was in the range of 200 days. It's probably increased hugely. I also believe that the privacy statements may not be written for comprehensibility. They may be written to cover every instance of data sharing that might occur, but not necessarily to be understood by the user. So the reality that the user is faced with is a difficult choice. Do I want to give up on the app or on the iPhone or on the device that I want to use or on the functionality that I need or on buying movie tickets online or on signing on to this site where I might be able to meet somebody and this is my biggest priority right now? Or do I want to carefully read this privacy statement and maybe say no? And for most people, there is no reading of the privacy statement. I'd actually like to see if there's any work that tracks how many people have read privacy statements and how far down they tend to go. I suspect that it would be in the, not even in the single digits, it would be in the 0.0% range. Anyway, the practical reality is that we have consented for legal purposes, and therefore anything can happen with that information. So that's what happens in the commercial sector. And that's a little bit different from what happens in the public sector. In the public sector, we have largely a notice-based system in Ontario and in most other provinces. And what that means is that public institutions just have to tell people what will happen to their personal information, and then they have notice. So individuals are given something that is known as a notice of collection. The notice of collection says to the individual, I'll take Ontario as an example, here is the institution you're dealing with, say it's a library or a licensing entity of the provincial government, say it's the Motor Vehicles Office, Ministry of Transportation. And what the notice of collection will say is, here's the information that we need. We need it for the following purposes: for licensing your vehicle, for sharing with insurance companies. There may be a bunch of stated purposes. And effectively what you as a member of the public can do is you can accept those terms or you can not get a driver's license. So it's notice-based, but effectively, once you have seen the notice, by proceeding, you're consenting to the terms of the notice. Technically, that's not called consent, it's called notice, but that is how the privacy law works here in Ontario. So privacy, of course, is the individual's ability to control what happens to their personal information, but there is a little bit of structure that goes around that and that informs how it's done. And because it's about information, there are certain activities that occur with information. There are certain things that companies or government do with information that can be regulated and that should be done in particular ways. And when I say can be regulated and should be done in particular ways, the privacy laws that exist follow certain patterns and do certain things consistently. And where there is no privacy law, the expectation and perhaps the hope is that entities that deal with your information will do these things as well. So here are the things. the things that happen to personal information are that it can be collected, it can then be used for certain purposes, it can be retained for a certain period of time or forever, and it can be destroyed. So collection, use, disclosure, retention, and destruction. These are the key activities that are done with personal information. And these are the key activities that are regulated in laws, and in addition, there are codes of practice or statements of principle that exist. The Canadian Standards Association has a privacy code that informs how the private sector deals with personal information and privacy, and that is the backbone of Canada's commercial sector privacy law, PIPEDA. There is another set of privacy principles called Privacy by Design, which comes from our previous Ontario Information and Privacy Commissioner, Anne Cavoukian, and that one is the backbone of GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a very important privacy law internationally. And there are other similar sets of fair information practices, but what they are and what they do, some may have 10 principles, some may have 7 principles, they regulate or they seek to structure what information is collected from individuals, what happens to that information, what individuals can do about their information. So here are the sort of key core principles. The first principle is that only information that is needed for the activity can be collected. So suppose that you are a library, you can only collect information that is needed, if you're the most basic kind of library, for a lending program, for books, electronic media, and so forth. You can't collect additional or other information. So that's a very basic bit of information about whoever might want the library books. Suppose, however, that you're a dating service, and you're a dating service that takes a very deep look at personality in order to match people. In that context, you're going to want a lot of detailed information from the individual, maybe a little bit about their activities, about their friends, about what they like to do on their day off, about their tastes in food, and so forth and so on, which goes a lot deeper, for example, than what a library would ask for. So the activity that you're wanting to do with personal information should inform exactly what you collect, and you should only collect what is necessary. The second principle is that you have to give notice to people and or get consent from them for what you're going to do with their personal information. So again, in some contexts it's consent, in some it's notice, but the bottom line is that the data subject, the person whose information is collected, should be fully informed of what's going to happen to their personal information. The third principle is that only the things that you have given notice about should happen to the information, nothing else. And then the information should only be kept for as long as is necessary for the activity. So that's the fourth piece. So the information that has been collected should only be used for the purposes that the individual had been informed of. It should be destroyed at the end of its useful lifespan. It shouldn't be kept beyond that time, in part because it's a risk, in part because it's an additional invasion of the individual's privacy, because what else would it be used for? So in order to protect the individual's privacy, the individual's ability to decide what happens to their own personal information, any information collected about somebody, once the purpose is done, once it's finished, should be destroyed, and destroyed securely. And finally, the individual should be able to get a hold of their own personal information in the hands of the organization. So if it's a dating service, if it's a library, and I've intentionally chosen a dating service which would be commercial and regulated by commercial sector privacy law, and a library which would be regulated by public sector privacy law. In either case, the individual should be able to go to the dating service or to the library and say, please show me all the information you have about me. The other thing is that the individual should also be able to find out all of the practices and policies around the handling of personal information. So those should be readily available to the individual. And finally, and this is key, without which none of the other rights matter at all, the individual should have the ability to challenge decisions and actions that happen with their personal information. So in the public library example, there will be a Freedom of Information coordinator at that public library or at that library board or at that city or town, if it's a city or town that is in charge of that library. And that Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy coordinator will be able to help the individual with those questions, will be able to accept a complaint about how the individual's personal information is being treated. And if the individual is not satisfied, there's usually a privacy commissioner. There's certainly one in Ontario and all the other provinces who deals with those questions. In the commercial sector, if you're not happy with what that dating company is doing with your information, you can certainly approach them, and they should have a privacy officer or an individual who at least wears that hat. And if you're not happy with what that individual does, then you can appeal to the Federal Privacy Commissioner, the Canadian Federal Privacy Commissioner, because it is likely, although not necessarily the case, that that company will be regulated by PIPEDA, by Canada's commercial sector privacy law. Likewise, if you're an EU citizen, you can complain to the EU Data Protection Authority about situations where you think your information is being dealt with inconsistent with GDPR, with the General Data Protection Regulation.